Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the third edition of the Grand Place Foundation seminar series. Today, we will be looking at the ideas of economics, production, and also just current issues in organic. As a reminder, this series started back on March 31st with a recorded presentation detailing the Reganold and Wachter paper from 2016 and introducing the idea of the sustainability comparison. Continuing on April 21st, we had a video detailing why organic, or starting to, and looking at the environmental and social benefits of organic production, as well as the One Health concept. So again, this is the Reganold and Wachter paper from 2016 detailing organic agriculture in the 21st century, just looking at some of the benefits and challenges of organic, specifically looking at their idea of this sustainability comparison, which has four facets. The final two, production and economics, we will focus on today. Starting with production, just to remind you, this is what Reganold and Wachter found in their 2016 review. So from the literature at that time, they found that on average yield in organic systems is 8 to 25% lower than in conventional systems. However, they mentioned there's a significant amount of variability in this, as you can see, 21% standard deviation. And this largely depends on what type of operation you're talking about. So they found that for rice, soybeans, and corn, there's only a 6 to 11% yield gap, whereas for things like wheat and fruit production, it was all the way up to 27 or 28%. Now, again, these figures are from a 2016 review, which is relying on research published before then. So I believe they were citing research from a 2012 synthesis paper. So let's look at what the recent literature has said since then. So to begin with, looking at this 2021 statistic from Langemeyer, you can see that on average, looking at the ratio on the right-hand side, that's the disparity between organic and conventional. Uh, on average, it's roughly around the 20% disparity that they mentioned in the Reganold and Wachter paper, except for things like wheat. As I mentioned, they only found 27 or 28% in Reganold and Wachter's paper, but from this data from 2016 to 2020, you can see that it's all the way up to a 50% yield gap in winter wheat. That said, we'll dive more into economics in the second half of this video. However, just want to point out quickly here that from this same data set looking at 2016 to 2020, you can see despite this yield gap between organic and conventional, the net return is still higher for organic production in every situation except for winter wheat, as you can see on the very bottom, negative 2.67 compared to a 0.4 return. But for everything else, you can see that organic has a higher net return economically despite this yield gap. Again, this is another figure showing the same data. You can see here for corn and soybean, two very important commodity crops, organic production of these net, it yields more despite this lower production. Moving on to a paper from 2023 from De La Cruz et al. Similar to the figures we've seen before this, they found an 18.4% lower yield in organic systems compared to conventional systems. However, one of the most interesting things they point out in this review is that this varies widely based on temperature, precipitation, crops, and soils. So we've seen different studies mentioning the disparity in crops, but the differences in temperature, precipitation, and soils have not extensively been studied, which could have a drastic effect on the production quantities seen. Now, here's another paper from 2024 from Connor. And in this paper, similar to, again, the figures we've been seeing, they found 19 to 25% less yield in organic system. However, they go further and claim this range of 0.3 to 0.74 production ratio, which would be 70% to 26% less. And this is interesting because their calculations here are including the amount of leguminous cover crop that would be needed to produce comparable amounts of synthetic nitrogen to what is currently used in conventional systems. So this is kind of just another take on the same thing we've been seeing, except they go further here um, to suggest that without the use of conventional fertilizers, that the production yield gap would be drastically increased up to even 70% is what they're claiming here. Now, in direct contrast to that last paper we saw, this is an older paper from 2007 from Bagley et al., where they modeled a data set with 293 instances, and from their results, they indicated that organic has the capacity to sustain the current population and more. However, they also indicate that the amount of nitrogen fixation from cover crops could replace the current amount of synthetic fertilizer used. So this is an older paper. However, it is interesting to point out that there is nuance in the literature, and whether this finding from Connor in 2024, stating that, the production yield gap would be drastically increased under all organic production, or this finding from Bagley that the amount of nitrogen from cover crops could completely replace synthetic fertilizer. I think more research, manipulative experiments should go into modeling this. Another interesting finding from Bagley et al., though, in this 2007 study is they looked at the yield gap in developed versus developing countries. And interestingly, they found that in developing countries, the organic systems greatly out-yielded the conventional systems, as you can see on the far right in this column, where these ratios are much greater than one, indicating that organic is yielding higher. In the developed countries, you can see that they're stating that conventional systems do yield higher, as we have been seeing in all the other papers. However, this is an interesting finding. Now, this study from Panisio in 2015 actually contradicts what we've just seen from this Bagley 2007 study, where they found no difference in developing versus developed countries. This study also used more data, they claim, than previous studies. They used over 1,000 instances, whereas Bagley only used around 293. So I'm more inclined to agree with this data, given it's also newer. Additionally, they found 19.2% yield gap between conventional and organic, which is similar to what we've been seeing in these other studies. However, a really interesting result from this paper is that they found that the specific practice used by the practitioners can reduce this yield gap. So, for instance, they found multi-cropping could reduce the yield gap all the way down to around 9%, and crop rotation, which is necessitated by organic production standards in the United States, at least, has the ability to drop the yield gap to around 8% as well. Now, another thing to add a little bit more nuance to this production argument, this comes from Reganold and Wachter in their 2016 paper. They say that we already produce adequate kilocalories of food to more than feed the world, but do not provide adequate access to all individuals. Globally, 1.9 billion adults are overweight, and of these, 600 million are obese, while 793 million people are undernourished, and more than 28% of children under the age of 5 are stunted due to malnourishment. So the argument here is that it's not necessarily the production, and this 20% increase that we see in conventional production systems is not really important in the grand scheme of things. Given that we produce enough kilocalories to feed the world, but clearly people are not being fed equally. To continue on with this train of thought, this paper from Berners-Lee in 2018 agrees with the sentiment in Reganold and Wachter and furthers it, saying not only do we produce enough food to feed the planet, but we produce enough food to feed a population of 9.7 billion, which is the estimated 2050 global population. However, they point out, similarly to Reganold and Wachter, it's not necessarily the amount of food we're producing, it's how we're using that. So they mention the meat and dairy industry consumes 34% of human edible crops, and 16% also goes to non-food purposes, such as biofuel. So this is just another instance of nuance that we need to add into this conversation around production. It's quite clear from the literature that Conventional systems can yield 20% more than organic systems. However, the question we need to be asking is this important? Is this really what we should be focusing on? And yet again, here's another paper that adds even more nuance and complexity into this issue from Hashimi et al. In 2024. So they used life cycle analyses, which is a measure of essentially pollution, greenhouse gas emissions effect on the global warming situation. So they used 100 different LCA studies on conventional versus organic agriculture, and they found that organic had a lower impact per unit area, but needed 64% more land than conventional products to produce the same amount. So again, this is another instance of looking at the fact that conventional clearly produces more yield than organic. However, again, this begets the question of land sharing versus land sparing, which is a raging debate in the field of ecology, essentially asking whether we should set aside certain area for nature and continue to do agriculture intensively on certain areas of land, or if we incorporate natural areas into agricultural lands. So currently, my field of study is agroforestry, which dictates the incorporation of woody perennial species into agricultural land, which is the land sharing idea. However, other people are advocates of land sparing, wherein we do very intense agricultural production on certain sectors of land and leave certain areas untouched. Ultimately, I think that this debate isn't really one side or the other. It's kind of a both and scenario. If we really want to preserve the ecosystem functioning of our natural environments and also maintain agricultural production, it's not a simple set aside some land, do intensive agriculture, or incorporate some aspects of natural landscapes into agricultural land. Truly is a both and. So in conclusion, it's pretty clear that organic production yields less than conventional by about 20%. However, this does vary by the type of production, what is being produced, and the management practices. And again, this increase of yield is not needed to feed the world. We produce enough food to feed the world if we utilize human edible crops in different ways. Additionally, despite the environmental benefits, organic production does require more land for the same level of production. So this adds nuance into this entire argument. Now to move on to the last facet of the sustainability comparison, economics. Reganold and Wachter in their 2016 review say that on average, organic is more profitable due to premium prices at the market, increasing demand for organic, and lower input costs over time. But let's see what recent economic research has to say about that. So as you can see, since 2016, this trend of increasing demand for organic food has continued and is expected to continue throughout time as well. In addition to the demand for organic increasing, the price organic products get at market is an average of 20% higher than conventional. So this is why we've seen the trend that even though organic yields less, it's still able to return more. Additionally, in 2016, over 80% of households purchased organic in the United States, and millennials are more likely to purchase organic products than older generations, indicating that this trend of increasing demand is only going to continue as millennial generations age and older generations age out. That said, with the amount of demand for organic products, we don't have the capacity to match that in the United States with domestic organic production. So as you can see, the amount of imported organic food has continued to rise and rise with demand, whereas exports have not. Part of this is due to the climate of certain foods, such as tropical fruits or other things of that nature. However, it's also because of the lack of adoption of organic in the United States, and it simply can't meet the demand of organic goods. As we can see from the previous slide, demand of organic products is outpacing supply, which has forced us to rely on importing organic. And it's important to note here, importers of organic must be certified or trade with a partner who has an equivalent organic certification process. So currently, those countries are Canada, European Union, Japan, Korea, Switzerland, Taiwan, and the United Kingdom. So moving on, looking at some research on the economics of organic versus conventional, this 2024 study from Poland found that conventional had 28% higher gross income, but also had 332% higher direct costs for production. So overall, they concluded that organic was 59% more economically efficient. As we mentioned in the last slide, with the 332% higher costs of production, you can see here in this graph, this is conventional production and looking at the costs, the inputs as a share of the revenue. So you can see here, things like fertilizer can make up between 50 all the way up to like 25% of the cost as a share of the revenue. Additionally, seed and pesticide can make up around 10%. So clearly, there are very high input costs for conventional production. Moving on, looking at this 2021 study, which reviewed 63 articles, found that generally organic outperforms conventional economically due to, again, these lower production costs, higher market prices, and all of this is despite, as we've mentioned, the fact that there are lower yields in organic production. Now, I think it's important to point out this caveat about cost data. So, as we've seen, several of these articles are suggesting that organic has lower production costs, which is true in some instances. However, there are other studies that claim that organic has higher production costs. So, this can also be true. That's why it's an important caveat to notice. This depends entirely on the crop, practice, and country in question. So, for example, for livestock industries that are certified organic, they can only use certified organic feed, which comes with a higher cost. Additionally, while organic doesn't have the same level of synthetic fertilizer and pesticide application costs, there are still costs for fertilizers and pesticides. However, there's also higher labor costs typically associated with organic production. So this is where the country in question really makes a difference on the cost of production, actually. So, for instance, in the United States, we have higher labor costs than other countries. So all of these contribute to the disparities in production costs. However, there is a perception of higher cost to organic production, which can deter the transition to organic. Now, for this last study, before we get into the actual results found, it's important to give a couple definitions really quickly. So, first, externalities. An externality is an action of an economic agent that directly affects another economic agent outside of the market mechanism. So essentially, an externality is something that is simply not picked up by the market. So as we can see here, some examples, externalities can be negative or positive. Some negative ones, for example, looking at an example of SUVs. So environmentally, they get less miles per gallon, which is not directly compensated for by the market. On roads, larger cars increase the wear on roads. Again, not picked up by the market. Safety as well. Accidents involving SUVs have quadrupled the rate of fatalities. However, none of these are directly picked up by the market. Additionally, there can be positive externalities. For example, honey producers, they positively influence surrounding agricultural producers through increasing pollination, but this is not directly picked up by the market. Now, to move on to why this is important, this study from Michalke in 2023 in Germany calculated the externalities for conventional and organic production. So as you can see here, for plant-based foods, conventional was significantly more expensive in terms of the calculated externality. And it's important to mention these are negative externalities in terms of wildlife, land use, pesticide, fertilizer use. All of these negative externalities are what is being picked up by the cost here. So plant-based foods, conventional is higher. Milk and eggs, conventional is higher, but not by much. And beef, conventional is still higher in terms of its environmental externalities. But again, it's not higher. And you can see as you move from plant-based foods to animal-based categories, the amount of externality increases regardless of organic or conventional. So you can see this demonstrated here in the graphs. So on the bottom, C is conventional, O is organic, and throughout all of these different categories, you can see everything except land use. Conventional has a significantly higher externality than organic production. Land use, organic has significantly higher externalities because, as we mentioned before, there's less yield. So to receive the same amount of yield, you need more land. Uh, this is for wheat production, and you look at cattle production, there is a lesser externality from organic production. Interestingly, terrestrial ecotoxicity is almost zero externality in organic production, whereas it's still pretty high in conventional. But again, land use in organic systems is significantly higher. So to conclude the economics section of this presentation, it's quite clear there's a significant increasing demand for organic products in the United States, which cannot be met currently by domestic production. So we're currently relying on a lot of imports. This signifies that there's a gap in the marketplace that domestic producers could fill. Additionally, overall, organic is more profitable due to the higher market prices, which can more than offset the yield gap that we've seen between organic and conventional. We've seen both sides of the coin in terms of production costs. So conventional production has higher input costs in terms of fertilizers and pesticides, but organic has higher labor costs and feed costs. And lastly, organic has fewer environmental externalities if these ever were to be incorporated into the price structure in the marketplace and actually be picked up on. Currently, they're not. But additionally, animal production, as we saw in those graphs, is a higher externality cost for both conventional and organic. Now, to move into the last section of this seminar series discussion, we will look briefly at a few current issues facing the organic sector as a whole. So one, as we mentioned, with environmental externalities, this idea of the tragedy of the commons, which essentially is talking about a common resource, which in this case is just the environment broadly, and talking about how farmers are not compensated for any good they do for society in terms of preserving wildlife or using less harmful inputs or anything like that. Simply, they pay for inputs, they receive products for payments, and the other stuff is not calculated by the market. However, in recent years, there are programs that are trying to change this. Incentives like the EQIP program from the NRCS, which is Environmental Quality Incentive Program. This provides cost sharing and funding for farmers who are demonstrating environmentally friendly practices. However, that's great. It's a positive incentive. But this study from 2013 looked at how humans respond to negative versus positive incentives and found that people are much more motivated by negative incentives. Next, another problem facing the domestic organic industry is adoption. So in 1990, less than 1 million acres of organic farmland existed in the United States. Today, that number is over 5 million. However, this is still less than 1% of the total acreage in the United States. So clearly, there is a lack of adoption by producers, which is a little confusing when you kind of get into all of the benefits that we've seen in this series in terms of environmental, economic, even, and social well-being. But that is the situation as of today. However, this does vary by crop type. So you can see commodity crops like soybean and corn are way less than 1%, whereas things like carrots and lettuce are up over 10% organic. Another issue facing the organic sector today is the management and assistance, specifically transitioning to organic, which is what TOP seeks to help producers do. However, producing in an organic manner requires knowledge that is different than producing conventionally. So again, there is growing technical assistance for this, but it's still a major problem for many producers. For example, 71% of young farmers have no idea about USDA programs that could benefit them as of 2022. So continuing, as I mentioned, the transition process from conventional to organic is one of the biggest holdups. given that growers must not use unauthorized organic amendments for 3 years before being able to be certified. So essentially, producers must be organic for 3 years before actually getting to reap the benefits of being certified organic. So that's a big deterrent for people transitioning. And again, TOP exists for this very purpose, the Transition to Organic Partnership Program. It's a network of mentorship and assistance and aims to help people transition. However, again, it's an entirely different management system, which can be daunting. And again, this 3 year holdup before being able to be certified is another um, daunting factor for producers. Another issue facing the organic industry, as we mentioned earlier, organic production on average requires more labor inputs, and the U.S. producers cannot generally compete in this aspect. Additionally, there are other certification labels such as certified naturally grown, locally grown, regenerative, organic, etc. There's lots of developing labels that compete directly with certified organic. Continuing on with this idea of certification, it can be a burdensome and expensive process for small producers. And as of this 2022 survey, 77% of respondents feared that there was fraud in the certification process in general. So clearly, there are issues in the certification process as a whole. Continuing on, there are systemic problems that exist in agriculture, much as they exist in any aspect of life. So, as of today, African American producers comprise less than 1% of organic producers, and 98% of the U.S. land base is controlled by white landowners. As of this 2022 survey, BIPOC producers identify a lack of access to capital as a major problem at double the rate of the average organic producer. So 53% compared to the average 27%. So clearly, there are a lot of problems facing the organic industry. However, as we have seen throughout this examination of the sustainability comparison, there are several benefits of organic production, not just in the realm of being more environmentally friendly. However, things like social well-being, which is not typically considered in the swath of benefits of organic production, there is a decent amount of research that suggests it is. Additionally, economics, there's a perception that organic production is more expensive and doesn't return as much. However, we've seen the contrary. We've seen that organic outperforms conventional almost every single time throughout recent literature reviews. So again, just to wrap up and recap all of these points from the first three videos of the series. So in terms of the environment, organic agriculture is less harmful to the environment than conventional, but managerial decisions affect this. Social well-being, practitioners of organic report higher levels of life satisfaction, and workers are exposed to less harmful chemical, poses a lesser threat to the common good. In terms of production, organic agriculture definitely yields less than conventional by around 20%. However, practices and crops considered can change this. And again, yield and getting that extra 20% of yield is not really the most pressing issue facing agriculture as a whole right now. And then lastly, in terms of economics, as we've seen in this presentation, organic returns higher profits for farmers, and there's growing demand for organic produce in the marketplace that is only going to continue as time goes on. So as a final conclusion for these first three videos, it's become very clear that this is a complex issue. You know, there are some conclusions in the research on a certain few facets, but overall, there's so many caveats and nuances to this argument of conventional versus organic that so many different areas need improvement and attention in this debate. Additionally, a blend of conventional and organic as we transition towards a more organic agricultural production system is needed. And so this is not just a black and white issue. And again, as we've seen, the transition process can be daunting. However, that is why programs like TOP exist, and that's why I'm here today. So with that said, the next few editions of the seminar series are going to look different than me just sitting here talking to you in front of a screen. We've got some interactive discussions and interviews on the horizon, so make sure you look out for those.